and welcome to all the men and women of the West. I'm Joe, here with me is my co-host Dan.
Hello and greetings.
And today we're continuing the Dragons of Autumn Twilight podcast. First things first, there were some things I said that kind of proved in some cases true or untrue in the eyes of certain commenters. First off, Brennan Guy did point out, apparently I'm wrong about Laurana having lied about Tanis and her having been engaged. It's just, in Dragons of Autumn Twilight, the way Tanis treats it, it's as though the engagement is almost not real, that it was just a childhood promise. He kind of belittles the relationship he previously had with Laurana. And so I got it in my head that they were not engaged. But in Dragons of High Lord Skies, it's blatantly stated they were. This is where I was kind of wrong there. And of course, Reflective Rambling is defending Tika again from us. She ended up commenting that she thinks Raceland's the most brutally honest of the companions. I don't know about that, but I do think that, once again, Raceland tends to lie to himself. But it's very obvious when he does it. He's not very good at lying to himself. But I guess there is a brutally honest side, but I'd say it's brutally honest in the way that Hiei from Yu Yu Hakusho is brutally honest. There is some deceitfulness to Hiei as a person, but there's also an honesty. It's just Hiei operates with a very twisted honor code that only Hiei and Yusuke seem to understand. We left off right before the Song of Gold Moon, which it's mostly her singing to Riverwind. It ends up that someone ends up injured, she heals the person, then the gang gets chased out. The person who set this whole thing up was Fizban, or I should say Paladin, setting things in motion. And that's the thing. The difference between Takesis and Paladin is the same as between Manwë and Morgoth. It's that Takesis will chuck a meteor or a mountain at something to solve a problem. Paladin will chuck a rock. He prefers you touch it with a needle approach, so that he's a lot smarter than Takesis. That said, Morgoth is himself a much more cunning villain than Takesis is. Now, Takesis probably has a bigger body count in some ways. Morgoth just has, in some ways, a more sadistic side to him. The only reason I say that is because of the Children of Húrin story, where he's just...
One thing I found entertaining was that the child that was listening to the song dismissed Gold Moon's song and was more interested in Fizban's story about Paladin.
The gang escapes through the back of the inn. They end up slipping off to Tika's house. It's in Tika's house that we're introduced to an aspect of Raceland and Caramon's relationship, which is rather abusive, in that Caramon is ordered to touch the staff after it has burnt Raceland's hand, with Caramon frightened and Raceland just forcing him into touching it, regardless of his fear, only for Raceland to then mock the notion that only someone pure of heart may touch the staff, which anyone who's read Brothers Magier or Soulforge, and even the Legends trilogy, will know is a laughable concept, because Caramon is not pure of heart. Likely, it's just simply, I guess you could say, a good person, generally. It is also there where Tass later rates the larder. Raceland is asked, after he sits down by Tanis, what do you think? And he says, if she's a charlatan, she's a good one. But the way he says it seems to be fairly thoughtful and doubtful. She's not a charlatan. The trouble is, Riverwind takes this personally. Well, he takes everything personally. They then raid Tika's place in order to make it look like they were criminals, which Sturm later complains about. Oh, that's another thing. Brennan Guy commented on how Sturm's a liar himself, which I disagree with, saying, well, he lied about how he's a knight of Solamnia. Actually, it's not a lie. He is a squire. Traditionally, in medieval times, a squire is a form of knight. You're just a knight in training, but you are counted in the order of knights, because it's a bit of a student thing. You're a journeyman. You're on your way to being knighted. You are still recognized as a chevalier, a knight. The thing with Sturm is he does belong to the knightdom of Solamnia, but he's just at a lower rank. It does not mean he's lying about being part of the knighthood. He is part of the knighthood. He's just not mentioned his rank, which is non-existent, almost. He's a squire to the Order of the Crown. He's the lowest of the low. It's revealed by Riverwind that he was taking Goldmoon to Haven, where the Theocrat and his order are from. That order of clerics who are in league with, essentially, local goblins who are patrolling the area. A mistake on their part, but we could chalk it up to ignorance. That said, the heroes of the Lance then escape from Solus. They trek out onto the road to the local Crystalmere Lake, which ends up being fairly humorous because Flint's sworn a vow never to get on a boat again after Caramon nearly drowned him, as Caramon and Tass stood up in the middle of the boat and nearly drowned Raceland and Flint. Difference is Raceland still has the colonies to get back on a boat. The trouble Sturm has in terms of reputation is, as he puts it, I don't like this, Tanis. First we're murderers, now we're about to become thieves, which I kind of get where he's coming from. His reputation's already shot in the knighthood, and now he's basically destroying what's left of his reputation elsewhere. That said, Caramon comments, I don't consider myself a murderer. Goblins don't count, which causes the knight to glare at Caramon. An interesting exchange between Raceland and Caramon, where Caramon tells Raceland, let me help you, and Raceland shakes his head and flinches away from his brother's touch, basically saying, let me at least have some dignity and walk on my own. I can at least walk to the lake. It's interesting here because Tanis is very judgmental. Caramon's offer of help is very patronizing here. It's like, oh, you can barely walk. I think Raceland needs at least a bit of dignity and pride here. Like, at least let me walk on my own, at least so far as the lake. Offer it patronizingly. Here it's about pride, but pride's about the only thing Raceland's got, which I kind of agree with Raceland there. And I even agree with Sturm, who kind of shows a lot of understanding towards this and sees it as, well, okay, that's fair. Tanis judges here. The thing with Tanis is that throughout the Chronicles, we get a lot of almost hatred towards Raceland. He's dependent on Raceland because Raceland's the brains of the outfit, but he doesn't like Raceland. I think it has to do with also with the fact that whose version of Caramon and Raceland did he get? He got Kitiara's version before he even met them. She's mistrustful of Raceland. She doesn't like him.
You never can trust her point of view.
No. That said, she is right that Raceland has a treacherous side. But on the other hand, it's because Raceland's a survivalist. He's got a lot of people who hate him. So he has to have that survival instinct. That said, Sturm actually mentions why Caramon puts up with some of Raceland's abuse. And there is abuse there. We're not saying there isn't. We're just kind of looking at it from every point of view here. Any comments? Family. Ties of blood. Now, Sturm sounds wistful because he longs for family. He has a better understanding of why Raceland and Caramon kind of put up with each other. They're family. It's blood. You have to. And Tanis doesn't understand it because he was adopted by the royal family of Qualinesti, and they've just abused him his entire life, except for Gilthanas and Lorana. In that regard, he's never had to put up with someone who he didn't want to. But we then get the gang getting on the boat. The gang get onto the boat, but it's only now that Raceland actually asks for help. Yeah, he says, I can't get my feet wet. So, of course, he asks his brother for help. But then when he does feel he needs help, he finally swallows his pride and goes, okay, I need help. I think part of the reason the relationship is toxic is that it's about other people. Tanis, Persalian, everyone keeps meddling into the relationship and keeps saying a bit of the toxic if people are content in a relationship, maybe it's not for others to interfere. Caramon is content to an extent with the relationship. To an extent, not entirely. He's miserable these days, as is Raceland. But the two of them are trying to find some sort of middle ground, once again. And every time someone meddles with the two end up miserable. So that it's like, maybe if people just left the two alone, they'd find their own common ground on their own.
Tanis doesn't know what happened.
It's like a child. You have to let him trip on his own.
And that is something that with people with disabilities or the elderly, you do have to approach it that way. You have to let them until they're willing to ask for help.
The trouble is, Tanis has that logic with Flint. Not. Tanis provides cover fire for Flint as Flint finally decides to get on the boat because he foolishly just said, you know what, ditch me. I don't want to get on a boat, even if it means death. Then he changes his mind. We get to see that though Tanis does not want to say it, he's like a child with a needle. He is inherently a fickle person by nature, which, hey, Raceland can be fickle at times. Kitiara is the same way. 3 of these former traveling companions who were fairly fickle. This is where I'm going to side with Tanis and Caramon. It can't have been easy traveling with these people. I'm just saying. First person to notice that the constellations of the Valiant Warrior and the Queen of Darkness have fallen from the stars is Raceland. You have Caramon who says something incredibly dumb. Don't get so worked up. It's only a bunch of stars. And you have Tanis. Only a bunch of stars. If in real life constellations fell from the skies and disappeared, we'd all be going, what the heck is going on? We'd be panicking. That's a big deal. Which I know people are going to say, going to try to rationalize that. No, that's not a normal reaction. These are the physical manifestations of 2 of the gods. Now, not many people are familiar with these gods. So on that end, I understand it. But it's just these stars falling and disappearing from the heavens. That's a big deal. That's not normal. That should not be treated as normal. And Raceland's the only one acting like a normal person about it, going, that's not a normal effect. But where he's different from the others, he mentions that all the evil rumors we have heard are true. War, death, destruction. Now, Raistlin's having a bit of a panic attack. This is where it's not about constellations, but about old lore. Where Tanis and Caramon are foolish, on that front, Tanis comes from Qualinesti. Qualinesti has some of the most old lore in Krynn. You look at Solamnia, they may be a little ignorant in this era of what it means. I'm just saying, there's the possibility of them being ignorant. Okay, it's fairly understandable. Tanis should understand what this means. He doesn't, which is just shocking. What do you think of these couple of chapters?
It's an escape. We have a bit of an introduction to how everyone reacts in the crisis. We have an insight on good to know that even though years have passed since they've traveled together, there's an aspect of that that's never changed.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting thing I like about the companions. I'm going to attribute that more to Tanis and Flint and how they've trained the companions. They basically honed them into a pretty good unit.
You'd think after a couple of years
they'd be rusty or something in terms of working with each other, but they aren't at all. They're actually better at working together than they were before. It's the self-discipline that they've gotten over the years from mercenary work and actual warfare, rather than just bandit fighting, like in the olden days. Now, the next video will be from chapters 6 to the end of chapter 8, or in the edition I have, page 59 to 91. So if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to smash that like and that subscribe button as though you were the gods chucking a meteor at Istar.